Hey everyone, Jeremy here. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're talking to Silvia Milano, who is a researcher at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute and also at the Oxford Internet Institute, where she works on AI ethics. And in particular, she's been focusing lately on the ethics of recommender systems. So we will be talking a lot about recommender systems. And in particular, one of the key areas we'll be zooming into is this question of who the stakeholders are in modern recommender systems. So is it just about the end user? Is it just about the person who interacts with the Twitter app or with Netflix or whatever it may be? Or do we have to start zooming out a little bit more and thinking about companies, thinking about systems, thinking about even societies and civilizations in which these recommender systems and their users are embedded? And the argument that Sylvia is going to make is that yes, in fact, we do. And they're really interesting ethical and practical questions that arise the moment we recognize that fact. So I think it's fair to say we're in for a whole bunch of really interesting conversations about everything from personal identity to the responsibilities of companies and governments in the context of very powerful recommendation systems. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you do as well. Sylvia, thanks so much for joining me for the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'm really thrilled to have you here. We've spoken before once briefly, but I'm really looking forward to kind of diving into things in a little bit more depth here, especially about your work with recommender systems, which is just such a hot topic. The ethical issues with recommender systems, I think, are things we're still struggling with. I mean, we've only barely started, really. But I'd love to ask you, before we get into the meat and potatoes of it, what was it that made you dive into this field in the first place? How did you get interested in recommender systems, and how did you end up doing the research that you're doing now?
It's a good question. It's a combination of factors. I was interested in human-computer interaction, and I had a general interest in this area. And I found, while reading around, that there weren't that many articles written on recommender systems and how this kind of systems structure our online interactions and really our digital lives. So that is how I first got an inkling that this is a big topic, but currently, there are so many questions that are unanswered, and I thought, I really want to look into that. So it's interesting both from an epistemological side, because, there are all sorts of questions. For example, how do we know when something is relevant to a user? How do we know that something is the right recommendation to make? And also from an ethical side, obviously recommending things seems like a very personal, targeted, individual action, but really has all sorts of social implications. And so ethically, I thought it was really interesting to try to understand and tear these things apart. What is the function of recommender systems in our society?
Yeah, and what keeps striking me every time I think about this problem is how, despite the fact that there are all these issues, recommenders obviously are here to stay. They're so important. There really isn't a way around them. I mean, the Luddite in me wants to say, like, okay, we've got recommenders that are arguably tearing apart the fabric of our society. Let's get rid of them. But the reality is, it's almost like, it feels almost like journalism, in the sense that no matter what problems there may be with it, the average person doesn't have time to go out and do the legwork of collecting New York Times level coverage of something. And we don't have time to collect that kind of information about products. It kind of seems like it's this thing that we have to solve, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I would say not just a normal person, any person. You cannot be an expert in every topic. And it would be saying that we can do without recommender systems at this point would be to say that we can do without all the trove of data and information that we have on the internet.
Yeah.
Yes, we could. We did that. We used to live that historically in that scenario, but clearly there's so much value in there that we don't want to throw it out. But to transform all this data and information that is available into something that is actually usable and that is relevant to our everyday life and to the way we reason, we do need recommender systems that are these things that help us to overcome the information overload, find a path, find a way through all this information through.
Yeah, and as you've pointed out so well too in all your research, I mean, they come at a serious cost. I think a lot of people are almost at a gut level broadly aware of what that cost looks like. They've seen how their behavior is affected by interactions with things like Twitter, with even product recommendations on Amazon. But could you take a second to kind of unpack some of the specific concerns that you have ethically about the impact recommender systems might have and the externalities they might generate more broadly?
Well, I propose a taxonomy for thinking about the ethical impacts of recommender systems. And I'm currently building on the taxonomy to answer the kind of questions that you're asking. So in this way of looking at them, we should distinguish between impacts that recommender systems have to the utility of different stakeholders. So the consequence of recommending certain items, certain information to users, how does that impact the utility of, say, the users themselves that consume the items or the information, or the providers who writes the information, the system itself, the platform that hosts the recommender systems, or society more at large. So this would be, we can think of it in terms of utility, or how the consequences are evaluated from the point of view of these different stakeholders, as we might call them. This is one dimension of evaluation. Another dimension would be more deontological, if you want, something that has to do with the action of the system itself. So whether these actions infringe some rights, for example, of the users, whether it encroaches on user autonomy, whether it violates some rights. This is something that we might not be able to cash it out in terms of the consequences of the recommendation, but it may be that the action itself is problematic. So I propose to look at the ethical impacts in terms of these two broad dimensions. And there are several challenges that immediately come to mind, and we can immediately see once we see things in this way. So for example, on the utility side, on the consequentialist evaluation side, there are all the things to do with, for example, how accurate these recommendations are, whether they promote the utility and the profits, for example, of the platform, of the providers of the items that are recommended, and of the users themselves. So these are a very broad host of considerations. There are also considerations that are more that have more to do with fairness and are more at the level of a system. So, for example, whether the fact that we construct recommender systems in a certain way, say, in the case of news recommenders, whether some narratives are foregrounded more, and why, and what are the impacts on our society.
Yeah, no, I think there's so much there. On the right side, this is something that always occurs. So my dad's a lawyer, and I would actually get into, especially when I was in undergrad, like studying quantitative stuff, I got really frustrated with the way he described the process, especially in criminal law, of coming to the conclusion of like guilty or not guilty with respect to a particular accused person. So he would always tell me that juries are apparently not supposed to think in terms of probabilities. There's this, like, obviously there's this injunction that someone is guilty, that will be found guilty if the jurors think that they're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But the moment you try to quantify that, the moment you try to say, okay, yeah, that means this threshold of probability, that apparently is like, that's a no-no, at least in the tradition of English law that my dad was familiar with, because we're Canadian. And that always frustrated me, because it was like, somehow, if we're going to make progress as a civilization, it feels like we really need to be able to quantify what rights are. And in the context of a recommender system, that seems like something that's really difficult to do. Is that something that's, first off, is that a problem that you think like is real, or is it something that I'm making up for myself here? And secondly, are there potential solutions, or is there a body of thought on that issue?
It's a very great question, and difficult to answer. At the moment, my thinking on this is that we really need to have this forefront in our mind. I don't have a solution to propose yet, but we do really need to have this front. Recommender systems really are social infrastructures, and so we need to think about how they impact people's rights, how the infrastructure works, should be evaluated in terms also of how it promotes individual rights, human rights, or the good functioning of society.
Yeah, and I guess we got to define what those things are too, which is like
Exactly, but that's that's tricky.
yeah.
It's certainly much easier to adopt a consequentialist evaluation, which is what I have been working on for the most part, partly for purely practical reasons.
And can you elaborate on that? So for people who aren't philosophers or who don't have that kind of training, so could you explain consequentialism and how it's all set up in this context?
Very broad definition of consequentialism would be that what matters in the evaluation of an action is the consequences that it brings about. So, for example, if you have a choice between two actions, A and B, what matters to their evaluation is the consequences of A and B. And the idea is that consequentialism tells you to bring about the most good.
Mm-hmm.
So you rank the consequences of act A and B in terms of how good they are. You choose the act that has the best consequence. Now, this is a very general idea. It has to be cashed out in terms of how do we measure the goodness of different consequences or states. So there are various things that need to be then finessed and defined more carefully, but this is the broad idea. And in the context of recommender systems, we are asking, given a recommendation that is given, let's see what the consequences of making this recommendation are for the user who receives the recommendation, for the other possible stakeholders in this recommendation. Let's try to quantify this goodness. And then on the basis of this, we can rank the different possible recommendations. This is a broadly consequentialist approach to evaluating recommenders.
So I find that really interesting because, like, as somebody with sort of more of a, I guess, a quantitative machine learning type background, consequentialism sounds so profoundly intuitive to me that then my next question is like, what alternative framework could I even use if not consequentialism? Like, what would be some of the leading alternatives?
An alternative to consequentialist frameworks in ethics is the ontological frameworks. In this tradition, actions are evaluated not just in terms of their consequences, but on the quality of the action itself.
Mm.
So, for example, a very famous consequentialist is, of course, Kant. He gives this very famous example of a murderer coming to your door and knocking at your door, and he's looking for somebody that he wants to kill. He's coming with his weapon, and it's fully transparent what his intentions are. And you happen to know where this person is. And so the question is, should you or should you not tell him? And famously Kant says, well, actually, you should always tell the truth. That's a duty that you have. So in this case, you should, if asked by this murderer at your door where the person that is looking for is, you should tell him. Obviously, you cannot arrive at this answer by evaluating the goodness, the utility of the consequence, because clearly the consequence that you can foresee if you tell the murderer the truth is a very bad one, where this person that you know will be murdered. So the idea here is that the action is evaluated not in terms of the consequence, but on the quality of the act. And for example, for Kant, lying is something that you should never do. It's your duty not to lie.
So that's interesting because I guess it places, pretty intuitively, it places a lot of religious convictions about morality and ethics into that bucket where you'd say, well, you can be consequentialist in every aspect of your life, except when it comes to, for example, observing the Sabbath. So like consequentialism for everything, plus also make sure that you take Friday evening off and Saturday morning off or whatever, things like that.
Or you could say you should never intentionally, or you should never deceive somebody, or you should never break a promise. That could be a constraint that is built. Actually, if we think about recommender systems, say, for example, in the context of news recommending, that could be a constraint that would be relatively intuitive, right? Say, you should never lie.
Well, and that itself is interesting because it already starts to introduce, I think, the looming specter of one of the greatest challenges of all of this, which is we have, I mean, this kind of utilitarian consequentialist perspective seems to be, it's almost as if it's not tied down to anything firm. I mean, the consequences can be interpreted differently by different people depending on social context. What we consider to be good today is very different from what we used to consider being good. I always think about the distinction between like the present version of me and then the future version of me who will be changed by my interaction with the system. And if I have this free floating like ethic of consequentialism, in a way, this is sort of hard to describe, but like before I ever used Twitter, my political views were some set of beliefs. And then after I used Twitter, my political views were a different set of beliefs. I changed as a person from that interaction. And the future version of me obviously thinks that they're right, but the past version of me thought they were right too. And it's almost as if the rights of the past version of me were violated in some weird way, or could have been, depending on what I was exposed to. But from a consequentialist standpoint, at every step, maybe it made sense. I'm not sure if I'm articulating this properly, but
yeah, no, that's a great example and a great question. So I think something that is perhaps implicit in a lot of research into recommender systems, at least when we are thinking of recommenders as trying to predict user preferences, is this idea that preferences may be something underlying and fixed. So we have our preferences and we merely lack enough information to know what we are looking for. Mm-hmm. And so the task of a recommender here is to help us out, because they are able to collect more information, to find out the items that are relevant to us based on our preferences, right? This is a natural way of maybe thinking about this problem, and I think it has a long history, inherits a long history from economic thinking, where it really ties to the analysis of preferences in economics. So here, the idea is that when you change your political beliefs after using Twitter on the basis of these recommendations, this would be because now you have more information. And on the basis of this additional information, you have refined not really your underlying preferences, but their expression. So now you have more information and you have narrowed down what these preferences entail. Now, this is one way of looking at it, but I think it's also very intuitive, and it speaks to many people's experience that in fact our preferences do not feel as fixed and immutable, and that maybe your experience of using Twitter and coming into contact with different views and recommendations is that actually these can influence your preferences, which may be more malleable than we could have thought, and respond to the information that you have, not just by updating your beliefs and giving you a better information about the world, which helps you to narrow down what things to prefer, but not really changing your underlying preferences, but really your underlying preferences are also updated in the process. This is much trickier to account for. So, and you're right in pointing out that there's some tension with the consequentialist evaluation, because of course, if the preferences are fixed, then we could think, for example, a system that satisfies user preferences over time as maximizing their utility.
Right.
But if the preferences change, we need to also figure out how this affects the measurement of how we evaluate the system over time. So if I recommend something to you at T1, and your preferences at T1 are such and such, I may do a good recommendation for that time, but the same recommendation at a later time when your preferences have changed, in part as a result of your interaction with the system, might no longer be utility maximizing. So I think it's a profound issue in philosophy. It's something that is debated, and I just want to mention the fact that there's a long tradition actually in philosophy coming from feminist philosophy that has pointed out how this traditional analysis of preferences is very limited. And in fact, people people's preferences are influenced by their environment and their interactions with other social actors. And this can have good and bad effects. So I think that there are several philosophical traditions that can be brought in to speak to this particular issue. And it would be very important for researchers in computer science to pay attention to this and to broaden a bit their outlook. Yes, because framing the problem of recommenders solely from the point of view of individual users under the assumptions that their preferences are fixed is very limiting.
Yeah, by some weird coincidence, I was looking into some of the like philosophical literature on identity, not from a like political perspective or anything like that. Just like literally like how do you track the identity of an individual through time? Like, am I actually to be thought of as the same individual as I was, 5 minutes ago? People often say things like, "I've changed. I'm a different person now." Like, do you mean that literally, or and in that case, what's the nature of your legal responsibility for prior actions? How could you be held accountable for what you do in the future, and so on? In the context of recommenders, it's almost like you have this debate between your own right at this exact moment to impose your preferences on the future version of yourself. Like, if you wanted to say, look, there's certain things about me that I would be disgusted if those things changed. Like, I would never want to be the kind of person who likes the color black or something. And then you look forward in time, like to 10 years, and if you had a magic algorithm that could show you, like, if you interact with Twitter for the next 10 years, all your clothes are going to be black. You're going to be like painting your apartment black, and you're going to love it. Like, what right do you have to kind of change course on that? That seems like such a thorny question. I mean, do you have any sense of, you pointed to a couple of examples, I guess, of the ways people are thinking about this, but is there any connection to the kind of philosophical identity literature that might be relevant here?
Yes, for sure. This opens up so many questions that are really fascinating. And I really like some of the analyses that are coming out of the philosophical literature recently in terms of thinking about changing selves in terms of maybe a group agent. So think of yourself as a collection of versions of you over time. And the thing is, when you consider an action at any time, the consequences of this action will span to your future selves, right?
Yeah.
And so this idea would be to take into account the interests of your future self, and well, you might have a lot of uncertainty about which future selves will actually materialize, and this might actually also depend on what action you choose at this point in time. And so there might be ways of conceptualizing this problem in a way that gives some guidance as to how to decide when you have changing preferences, and in this sense yourself isn't fixed. So this is a way that I think is very interesting to look at this problem. Of course, the more general problem of personal identity goes back to very ancient times. The philosopher in ancient Greek, Heraclitus, said, we don't cross the same river twice. And I guess the idea is that, everything is in flux, everything changes. And in this sense, this is a very profound problem that maybe we will never find a solution, or maybe some very bright philosophers will, but I don't think we need to crack the very, very hard philosophical problem in order to build good recommenders, which is a good thing, because otherwise we will basically be stuck.
Right. Yeah, no, true. It's always useful to draw that distinction between what problems we're facing today and then the problems we might face, 10 years down the road as technology improves, and we might actually be forced to face some of these questions head on. Fortunately for now, it's a little bit more contained. But in terms of that paradigm, so you put forward this idea of the multi-stakeholder framework in your research, this idea of kind of zooming out and saying, okay, we no longer just have like the user's immediate interests in mind, let's say. We have a kind of a broader collection of different actors and stakeholders in the situation. You alluded, I think, to some of the stakeholders in this model, but I guess, would you mind expanding a little bit on the multi-stakeholder framework and how it changes the way you've been thinking about recommender systems?
The idea here is that a multi-stakeholder recommender system is one that takes into account the interests of multiple stakeholders when formulating a recommendation. And this is in contrast with a paradigm for recommender system research that has been the central one for a relatively long time, which only takes, we can call it the user-centered approach, where users essentially are the only stakeholder. So in this older, more traditional, if you want, paradigm, the task of a recommender system is to find good items, where good items are items that are beneficial to the user of the recommender system. In the multi-stakeholder version, instead of only taking into account user interests, we also think it's necessary to take into account the interests of other stakeholders, which I think should include at least 3 other categories. The first 2 are relatively already inside the recommender system ecosystem, if you want, which are the system itself, so the platform, and providers of the items. So let's expand a bit on both, perhaps. The providers are whoever the parties that make the items that are then recommended available. So in the case, for example, of an e-commerce website, the providers might be the sellers who put the items, the different items on sale on the platform. Or in the case of news recommenders, it might be content producers, so whoever writes, for example, a blog or an article. Or video recommenders, it might be whoever produces a video. These providers have interest in the recommendation, obviously. So if you are, for example, a seller on Amazon or eBay, you have an interest in your item being recommended. And not only that, maybe only you also want it recommended to the right people who might actually be interested in it and buying it. So clearly you have a stake in the recommendation. And then, as I said, the other stakeholder that needs to be taken into account is the platform or the system itself. So obviously, in order to be viable, there needs to be some return for the system itself. So for example, if you are operating an e-commerce recommender system, you want this to be, to have some profit out of it. Same if you are a news recommender system. Otherwise, this would simply not be a viable business. So we have users, providers, and the system. And I also propose that we should consider society as a whole, as a stakeholder in recommendation. And the reason for this is that although it's more difficult to conceptualize how society has an interest in how recommendations are made, very, very often the behavior of a recommender system has broader social impacts. And it would be hard to tie them to the interest of particular stakeholders that are operating within the recommender system, for 2 reasons. For one, that is more straightforward, is that because very often even people and groups that are not on the recommender systems can be impacted by its actions. So for example, even if you don't use Amazon for your shopping, you might be impacted by its popularity. Because, for example, if you operate a small business, then you might really feel the impact of Amazon's popularity. So even if you are not a direct stakeholder in the recommender system itself, your interests are also impacted. And society as a whole, often we see systemic effects of these recommenders. The most obvious case would be with news recommenders, but this can be present in other cases as well, where the fact that the algorithm is tweaked in one way or another leads to the popularity and the distribution of different views that can have an effect, for example, on political events or what people think in general and the functioning of our societies. So these things are extremely important and obviously very relevant to the evaluation of recommender systems. So I think they should be taken into account, and the way in which we can do it is by including a stakeholder as representing the point of view of society itself. And okay, so now we have 4 stakeholders, and the idea with the multi-stakeholder system is that once we have identified the stakeholders, there are 2 things that we can do better than if we didn't. One is to define better evaluation of recommender system. So what metrics can we define to evaluate the impacts of recommenders? And secondly, we can also better understand what kind of optimization problem we are dealing with. So what are the kind of objectives that we are trying to maximize here? And in the definition of this, we can try to take into account the objectives that all the different stakeholders might be trying to achieve.
Well, yeah, and it's so fascinating to look at it from that perspective, because it really does, I think, open up the deep and important questions then once you start taking that perspective. One of which I could imagine being, when you're building a recommender system as a personal project or inside a company, it's convenient to focus on a user-centric approach, because that's what gives you really fast iteration time, right? You can measure a number like user satisfaction really easily. How many items do users put in their shopping carts? How many movies do they watch? That sort of thing. And the cycle times start to get longer and longer as you start zooming out and saying, okay, then from the standpoint of the company, like how profitable is this recommender system? You've got to wait to see what the costs and benefits are, maybe amortized over like a quarter or a year, or who knows. And then to broader society, those timelines get really long, so that the measurement process becomes challenging, maybe prohibitive. Is that a reasonable issue with the next step now of implementing this in the wild?
Yes, I like this question. I think this points to what are reasonable and useful choices of what we call levels of abstraction in conceptualizing the problem of that recommender systems address. So some choice of level of abstraction, for example, user-centered approach, would go more naturally with a shorter time frame, as you said, for evaluation. Whereas levels of abstraction that include social evaluation would require also different data and very probably longer time frames for evaluation. So that's certainly an interesting, I think, research problem.
Yeah, it's like, even in a business context, it's funny, the availability of data, it's exactly what you said there. Sometimes the kind of data that you need to evaluate a particular model or a particular product just isn't available. So you end up looking for proxies, and those proxies are not always, they can become pathological. There's an example I've given, I think, twice on the podcast, because I find it very funny and very instructive when it comes to evaluating human behavior. And that is, somebody once said, and I can't remember who, but if you A/B test a website and iterate often enough, eventually, sooner or later, any website will become a porn site. And that's a joke, but it's also, I think it says something deep about measurement and optimization for human preference, that depending on your time horizon, if you're user-centric and you're really focused on satisfying immediate limbic user needs or wants, you're going to end up with a product that isn't very cortical, that isn't very forward-looking, very deliberate, and probably with a lot of side effects that you're not thinking about. What I really like about the multi-stakeholder approach is it implicitly says, no, you're now looking at one corner of this equation. There's a much bigger kind of set of terms to factor in here.
Yeah, yes, I really like the way you're putting it, and your example is certainly striking. I think there are several things that can be taken out of it. One is questioning, well, of course you're looking for proxies, but proxies for what exactly? For user preferences, and if the behavior of the users that you observe is really taken to reveal their underlying preferences, what can we say of cases like this? Or cases where also it might be possible that users might have more considered preferences. So if they were really aware of how the system is, how the testing in this case is uncovering some revealed preferences, would they want to change it perhaps? Would they want to have a level of control and agency over how the system evolves and how, what is shown to them? Do they want to act on their own tastes? This is something that I think is a very fascinating question. And then, of course, there's also the problem of nudging, whether in cases like this, whether it's acceptable or ethically proper to nudge people in ways that may go counter their revealed choice behavior. So do you think, for example, that you should be shown more, say you're on a e-commerce website, more options that are environmentally friendly and that are more sustainable, even if your purchasing behavior indicates that you are really after the cheapest products and are not paying attention to environmental sustainability?
Do you think that there's from this conversation, I think it almost seems like one of the parameters that we've been alluding to is like implicitly time horizon, where it almost seems as though, like, if I'm optimizing for my happiness 1 second from now, I'm going to be carrying out a certain set of actions that probably follows something like a path of least resistance. So I'm going to be doing the easiest thing at every incremental time step. And if you add that up over a long period of time, eventually I end up, like, I don't know, in a casino somewhere gambling away my life savings. I mean, it really does kind of follow the limbic system in that sense. But if that time horizon gets lengthened and I start to say, okay, I have now like a fiduciary obligation to myself 10 minutes from now. Well, okay, maybe 10 minutes from now, I'm doing something a little bit different. As you start extending that time horizon, pretty soon you get into things like foregoing present value for future value and so on. And factoring in, it's almost like in the process of doing that, you're paying homage to your former self who set this course of action in motion all that time ago. Like, I graduated from my undergrad because of a decision made by myself that I honored 4 years before I started the degree. And that person knew that this was going to be a painful transition. And every incremental step, I decided to say, there's a path of least resistance, which is dropping out and lying on the couch, but I'm not going to go in that direction. It almost seems like what this framework does is it starts to introduce that time horizon. I wonder if that's a useful parameter to use to to parameterize different recommender systems and sort of the ethical implications of each.
Here's my current maybe thinking around this. I think you're touching on very profound issues about intertemporal choice, and again, are we the same person as we were? And the fact that recommender systems are often giving recommendations that are targeted at us on the basis of the current query or our current interaction with the system implies a very, very short time frame. So this would be really a path of least resistance. For example, if the system is interested in maximizing the time you spend on the platform, or how you optimize your clicking behavior, this can really tap onto the path of least resistance, what seems most gratifying to the user at the present time. But really, this is not what is in the best interest of the user for a longer period of time, or what is socially best. And I think there are several dimensions to this. So ethically, of course, there's the problem of choosing the right level of abstraction, so that we are capturing really the right level of granularity for what is the user's interest. So a very short time frame seems wrong, because, or at least maybe it depends on the applications, but in many applications it seems wrong because maximizing your immediate gratification may mean that you forgo other goods that you would value more highly, but that require more restraint from. So for example, if we try to maximize the amount of time you spend on a video streaming platform, that might really be something that you, in the moment you enjoy, but you might regret. But on the other hand, choosing a very, very long time horizon might be impractical for reasons that we don't have as much data, and also it's more difficult to frame the problem. And also it could be problematic, because that means that we are tying the evaluation of what is good for you to your current opinion, and this may change over time. And so there must be a way of finding the right spot. So that's a very interesting problem.
It's really fascinating from a practical, like a design standpoint, a systems design standpoint. You know, if you're a startup building recommender systems, like what does this imply? And it also, one of the things that strikes me is like we kind of have a way of accounting for long-term user preferences of the kind that we're talking about. Let's say long delta T preferences versus the shorter ones. If you go to Twitter, for example, you can always change your settings. If you go to Amazon, I'm sure you can change your settings there as well. I feel like what we've done is we've abstracted away the long-term part of this, the part where we go, what kind of person do I want to let this platform turn me into? And we sort of move that into the settings part. The problem is that our interactions almost invariably, like when I go onto Twitter, I don't start at my settings page. I start inundated in the sea of opinion and virality. And it's also these memes that are being floated around. Everybody's trying to persuade me. I don't start with my long-term self in mind framed sort of right in front of me. But there is, I guess, technically that niche area where, yes, I mean, I could go to settings and start to define my experience more broadly. I wonder, from a practical standpoint, if that might be part of this, like as a recommendation for companies even to say, look, settings maybe should be something you respect a little bit more, either by reminding people to look at their settings periodically if they're concerned about what's happening to their attention span, their experience on the platform, that sort of thing. Does that seem like a reasonable extrapolation here?
That seems reasonable. I think also that while it's very important and valuable that platforms give you some choice on how you can go to the settings page and see how the system is at least a little bit how the system is modeling you, and you can make some changes there. It does feel a bit like a chore. It's not so. I don't think the issue is that we should have more. It would be good to have more access and have more control over the settings, but also having that would not necessarily solve many of the issues that we currently have. It needs to be more front and center and part of the user experience. So I think a good an example that at least I like is how some recommender systems that do seem to be working well in empowering users and giving a sense of autonomy and control over how the system works for them and with them, helping them develop the recommendations, is a case of a recommender system for music. And I think that's a very interesting case where the system is designed in such a way that users really can interact with it, and by seeing how it responds to their listening behavior, learn about their own tastes, and can also learn how to influence how the recommendations are made.
Right.
This may be a way that people interact with Spotify or other platforms. All I'm saying is that in this case, you have not only we should have not only the ability to access the controls, but we should have like active incentive to do so, and we should be part of that activity. It shouldn't be so, as long as it remains something that you have to do, like do the laundry or do these other things. That seems like an extra burden that is not really something that feels like is paying off for us, or that is an interesting part of the experience that we have online. But it really can be. It really can be a way of not only getting like recommendations that are gratifying, but also learning how to, learning about ourselves, how we interact with different things and how these things bring us gratification, and having the sense that we can influence this process. This is very important because essentially, I really want to stress this. Recommender systems, although users are always front and center. They are a social infrastructure. Losing sight of all this means that we lose a lot of accountability and agency over how social interactions over these systems develop. This, I think, very, very important. And definitely, I think it would be such a great news if companies and developers that build recommender systems had this more in mind when they design it. So the fact that not only you need to give users more control for privacy reasons or because it's like it's good practice, but also because it really enhances the experience of a recommender.
Yeah, and I really do wonder actually if, to what degree long-term profits are affected by this kind of behavior. We've seen Twitter come under fire for various political division stuff, things, and Facebook likewise. It seems like by optimizing for the short-term preferences and not thinking in the way that you're describing here, what we've got now is an ecosystem that's starting to at least be viewed in different terms. And I've seen people start to liken Instagram use to smoking and social media to smoking. We have this, not The Social Network, but whatever that movie was. Anyway, the big one on Netflix.
The Social Dilemma.
The Social Dilemma. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we're starting to actually talk about these things, and I imagine that that's going to affect the bottom line of these companies over long periods of time, which in a way, might just be Goodhart's law in action, basically. They've optimized for short-term reward, and they thought that was a good measure. They thought that was the thing to optimize for, but they're learning that actually in the really long term is decoupled from sustainability and sustainable growth. I mean, I hope that's the case. One of my concerns is that maybe you just get so much of a competitive advantage that it kind of washes out those long-term effects. I don't know if you have any thoughts about this. Maybe this speaks more to the business side of the equation, but
yeah, this certainly speaks more to the business side of the equation, of which I am less of an expert. And I certainly do hope that it works out for the good of all of us, that we move away from a short-term outlook and trying to maximize short-term gains. I think there are parallels also in even looking inside recommender systems and some of the problems that are appreciated even by current platforms. So say one that is very prominent is the fact that they can give rise to echo chambers or also different kind of feedback loop effects. And the fact that some popular items on several types of recommender systems can have a disproportionate exposure. There can be cycles where something that is popular gets recommended even more, and this is widely perceived to be a big problem. One of the reasons I think is that give rise to these kind of things is precisely this focus on the short term. So the idea that if you're a user and you're logging in, then it's a safer bet for you to be shown something that is popular. It might be correlated with the quality, because you might think, actually, that you could formalize this problem and try to prove that if many people have liked this thing, this item, then it's more likely to have a good quality. But in the case of recommender systems, this obviously gives rise to pathological effects, because this wisdom of the crowd type of extracting value from the fact that many people have liked it works if everybody has access to all the information about what things there are. Mm-hmm. And if observing that you like an item is independent of whether it was recommended to you. But obviously this is not the case. So instead we have these feedback effects where trying to cash in on the fact that an item is popular by inferring that therefore it must be good quality actually leads us to instances where even items that are bad quality, for example, because they are fake news or things that are not genuinely relevant get recommended more and more because they have been seen and interacted with more users in the past. So this is also, I think, a case where we have to decide whether to focus on the short-term interest or look at the problem in a more diachronic light. So short term, it might well be that the best shot that you have is taking the popular item. But this degrades the whole system. So now the thing that you chose only because it's popular, and your choice doesn't really reveal anything of interest to the system itself and other users that come after you, simply reinforcing a signal that was, So how can we instead take a more long-term approach and try to preserve the information? And so this also might mean that users themselves need to be need to have more responsibility. And this might be something that, that might be difficult maybe for users to accept or for recommender system provider to explain. That sometimes recommendations can be, so users are also responsible for maintaining the quality of the system itself. The fact that you interact or like with a certain item is sending a signal back and is influencing who else and how much this item will be recommended to others. So you do have some sort of responsibility towards others, and therefore, this needs to be taken into account in the recommendation and in how we learn from user behavior.
Well, and there's so many differences too from platform to platform. I mean, like looking at Twitter, for example, bots plausibly accounted for. I spoke to somebody who suspected that circa 2016, he thought that maybe most of the activity on Twitter was bot activity. I'm not sure how that's translated to 2020 terms, but I imagine it's only gotten worse. To that extent, you've got Twitter that has this universe of or constellation of problems, Facebook with another, and then you've got Instagram and you've got Snapchat and you've got Amazon. At a certain point, I mean, I guess one of the challenges for any kind of policy action or government regulation of these things is that you need such a quick, thoughtful response that which governments often just aren't tooled to do. There just aren't the kinds of technical or ethical thinkers there who can respond quickly. So do you think this is an area where it's basically all on companies and on individuals to try to turn things around, or do governments have a role to play in trying to internalize some of the externalities that are generated by these systems?
Great question. I do think that there's a role to play for institutional actors. For the simple reason that this may be, so placing responsibility for these on users may be unfair, for the reason that users have very little information and very little time also to invest on figuring out how the systemic effects of the systems they interact with will play out for society. So what can be the case is that users can be made more responsible and informed about how recommendations are made. Recommendation can be made more transparent, and this can have a positive effect in giving users more control over the trajectory. But this cannot mean that users are really tasked with policing the good functioning of a system. Can be that, so you could, for example, signal that a certain account may be a bot or maybe exhibiting suspicious behavior, but really as a user you're not in a best position to do that often, because you only see a very limited fragment of that account's activity and you only have a very limited appreciation of how this can have negative effects. On the other hand, giving all these responsibilities to platforms to sort it out themselves also clearly has very, very serious problems and issues. One is that we might not want platforms to be the arbiters of what is good behavior online. we might not want platforms to decide what kind of accounts or what kind of speech to censor, or we might not even want platforms to decide how to structure a marketplace. Maybe there should be limits to that. So neither platforms or users can be expected to really, so they can be expected to take more responsibility, but they cannot be expected to solve the problem. So really, I do think that institutional actors need to step in. And the way they might do it is by designing regulation that might make it easier for external actors to observe what is going on these platforms and intervene.
Okay, so that's interesting. I was just going to ask, if it's going to be, because you said institutional actors, you didn't say government, which I thought was really interesting. And I know, obviously, you work at the Future of Humanity Institute, so it's sort of like this interesting middle ground between, it's not government policy, but it's also not a private sector thing. It's somewhere in between. Are you seeing things like the Partnership on AI or different kind of organizations that might have the technological capacity to intervene and the policy wisdom without necessarily the baggage, the institutional baggage of slow-moving governments? Do you see those as the vehicle to make this happen?
Yeah, I do think that civil society should have a much greater role in regulating technology. Now, I'm not a political theorist, and I can speak as a as a philosopher here.
Yeah.
I do think that civil society needs to be valorized more. There are several reasons. So governments can aid this by designing regulation that empowers civil society to have more oversight. I'm thinking especially of social media platforms where recommender systems clearly have such an impact in shaping, for example, political discourse. We are seeing this more and more, but also marketplaces. Like at the moment, one big issue there is that the systems are, the algorithms that power these systems are proprietary and cannot be directly observed.
Right.
So as we were saying, users have a very limited knowledge of what is going on because you only see a very little fragment of the whole system. Platforms cannot be expected to take on the whole responsibility, both because there's a conflict of interest and because they might not have the right capacity, the right capabilities. But for civil society to come in, and here I want to say institutional actors, and I want to remain neutral about whether they are government affiliated or civil society more broadly, need to have a role need to be able to audit these systems and observe how they actually work. And in this way, they can also empower individual users and other stakeholders to make sense of their online experiences. So for example, if I am a civil society organization or a research team that wants to study how information, for example, about vaccination programs is distributed online, I might need to have access to how the, for example, a social media feed is targeting different pieces of information to users when they log into their social media account. Mm. There's various ways in which this can be done, and at the moment, these are very, very restrictive. So, for example, asking users to share their data and asking users to give external researchers access to what they see online is not currently permitted, partly because of privacy regulation. But it's essential if we want to have an overall picture and be able to see how the algorithm that is making the recommendation is impacting how the information is spread. And then if we want to measure the social impact of the same algorithm. At the moment, we can only see the effect after, or we can try to reconstruct its likely, its likely contribution. But this needs to be done much, much more transparently and in a way that it can be audited. So, in this, the role of governments would actually be pretty central in allowing, so in writing legislation that makes this possible.
Well, the one fascinating thing I find with all this is no matter which direction you point yourself in when looking at these systems, inevitably you end up opening up a can of worms, and there's questions for governments, there are questions for philosophers, there are questions for startup people. So I really appreciate you stopping by and sharing your really fascinating perspective on all this stuff. If people are interested in following your research, following your work and your thinking on this, where should they go?
So they can go to the Future of Humanity Institute website or to my own personal website to follow updates on my work, and also follow the work that is coming out of the Governance of Emerging Technologies project at the Oxford Internet Institute, where I'm collaborating with other researchers, including Sandra Wachter and Brent Mittelstadt and others, in researching more generally the societal impacts of new technologies like recommender systems.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Silvia. We'll make sure we include those links too in the blog post that'll come with the podcast here. So thanks for stopping by. Really appreciate it. Very fun conversation.
Thanks for having me.